The scream came so fast, I didn't have time to react. My glasses went flying, shattering on the elegant living room floor, while 40 guests watched in absolute silence. My cheek burned, but the pain in my chest was much worse. Brittany, my daughter-in-law, had just slapped me in the middle of her gender reveal party because I refused to hand over the deed to my house. But what I didn't know was that this slap would trigger a revelation that would destroy their perfect world in less than 30 minutes. "That's what you get for being so selfish," she screamed at me in front of everyone. "A woman your age doesn't need a 4-bedroom house. You're being ridiculous." The silence that followed was deafening. No one moved to help me as I crouched down, trembling, to pick up my broken glasses, until I realized that this moment of humiliation was about to become their worst nightmare. Some guests looked away, uncomfortable. Others whispered among themselves, but no one, absolutely no one, dared to defend the poor mother-in-law who had just been publicly humiliated. My son Michael stood motionless, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if I were invisible. "You're not welcome here anymore," Brittany continued, smoothing her perfect pink dress. "Michael and I need privacy to start our new life. Your house would be perfect for us while we look for something better." What none of them knew was that I had been secretly financing their entire lifestyle for 2.5 years. Her words were pure poison. For months, I had endured her condescending comments about my worn clothes, my old car, my simple life. But this had crossed a line that should never have been touched. I rose slowly, feeling all eyes on me like sharp daggers. Tears streamed down my face, but inside, something had changed forever. That slap wasn't just a physical blow. It was the final straw. For years, I had kept a low profile, living with humility and discretion. I had secrets that no one, not even my own son, knew. And in 25 minutes, those secrets would change everything. Memories of the last few months began to bombard my mind as I slowly walked toward the exit, until I remembered the phone call that would end their financial security forever. I remembered when Brittany first came to my house 2 years ago. Her face fell when she saw my modest home, my old furniture, my small kitchen. "Seriously, this is where Michael's mom lives?" she had asked him, her voice loud enough for me to hear. What she didn't know was that I was carefully studying her every move. From that moment on, every visit had been silent torture. "Margaret, you should move to a smaller place," she told me 3 months ago during a family dinner. "At your age, you can't maintain such a big house." But I was about to show her exactly who could maintain what. "Besides, Michael and I are thinking of having children soon. We'll need more space." Her fake smile didn't fool anyone except my son, who seemed to lose his personality whenever she spoke. Until tonight, when his puppet strings would finally be cut. The humiliations had escalated gradually. First it was the comments about my clothes. "Margaret, don't you have anything more modern to wear?" Then came the comments about my car. "That car is so old. It's dangerous for you to drive that." What I didn't tell them was that I chose to live this way for a very specific reason. Next it was about my part-time job at the library. "I don't understand why a woman your age is still working instead of relaxing." Each phrase was a small poison dagger stabbing at my self-esteem. My name is Margaret Thompson. I'm 67 years old, and all my life I've been a woman who prefers discretion over ostentation. I work at a small library 3 days a week. I drive a 12-year-old car. I buy my clothes at discount stores. But that's exactly the image I had carefully cultivated for decades. To the outside world, especially to Brittany, I'm just a middle-class widow living on a fixed income. But that's exactly the image I cultivated carefully for decades. What none of those people looking at me with pity knew was about to shock them beyond belief. What none of those people looking at me with pity knew was that my life had been completely different before my husband passed away. My husband, James, hadn't been the office worker everyone believed until they discovered the truth about our real empire. We had made a conscious decision to live modestly, to keep our true wealth secret, to protect our family's privacy, in a way that I now understood had been prophetic, and tonight, that protection was about to end. As I left the living room, the guest conversations followed me like a toxic cloud. "Poor thing, she looks so fragile," whispered Brittany's aunt. "The bride is right. That woman can't take care of herself anymore," added Michael's cousin. What they didn't know was that I had been taking care of all of them. "She should be in a nursing home, not living alone," commented another guest with false compassion. Each word was like acid pouring on open wounds. The cool temperature of the living room's air conditioning contrasted sharply with the suffocating heat in my chest. My hands trembled as I fumbled for my cell phone in my worn black purse. But what I was about to do would make their hands tremble much more. A purse I had used for 5 years, not because I couldn't afford a new one, but because I had learned to value practicality over appearances. Something my daughter-in-law would clearly never understand. I dialed a number I knew by heart, a number I hadn't used in over a year, because I naively hoped it would never be necessary. Until tonight, when everything would change forever. "Robert, it's Margaret. I need you to come to Brittany's house immediately. Yes, right now. Bring the documents you know about. It's time for them to know the truth." What I didn't know was that this phone call would destroy their lives in 30 minutes. My voice trembled, but there was a firmness in it I hadn't felt in a long time. "Are you sure, Mrs. Thompson?" Robert asked with his professional but concerned voice. "Once we do this, there's no turning back." But there was no turning back from what they had done to me. I looked back at the living room one last time, where I could see Brittany laughing with her friends, probably telling them how she had put her useless mother-in-law in her place, until she discovered who really held the power in this family. Michael was beside her, smiling weakly, showing not a single ounce of remorse for what he had just witnessed. "Completely sure," I replied. 30 minutes, Robert, no more. And in those 30 minutes, their perfect world would crumble. I hung up the phone and walked toward my car with determined steps. For the first time in years, I was going to drop the mask I had used to protect my family. What they were about to discover would haunt them forever. For the first time, they were going to meet the real Margaret Thompson. And when that happened, when reality hit their perfect fake worlds, they would understand the true meaning of the word regret. But I had no idea how deep their betrayal actually went. The parking lot was quiet, lit by streetlights that cast long shadows between the cars. I sat in my old sedan and waited. 30 minutes for their lives to change forever. 30 minutes for them to discover they had made the biggest mistake of their lives by humiliating the woman who had secretly been taking care of them more than they could ever imagine. Until I remembered the documents that would prove everything. While I waited in my car, memories of how I had reached this inevitable moment began to flood my mind like an unstoppable avalanche. What I discovered about their plan would shock me to my core. It had all started exactly 2.5 years ago, when Michael came to my house with that nervous smile I knew so well from when he was a boy. "Mom, I want you to meet someone very special," he told me. But what I didn't know was that she had been planning this from day one. And there she was, Brittany, with her perfectly styled hair, her designer clothes, and that smile that didn't reach her eyes. From the very first moment, I knew something wasn't right. Until I discovered just how wrong I was about everything. The way she looked at my house, evaluating every corner with thinly veiled disdain, told me everything I needed to know about her intentions. "How cozy," she had murmured as she looked at my second-hand furniture. But what she was really calculating was the property value. Her tone suggested the opposite. Michael, completely blinded by what he believed was love, didn't notice the condescension in her voice until the night I overheard her real plan. That first dinner had been a silent disaster. Brittany barely touched the food I had lovingly prepared, claiming she was watching her figure. What I didn't know was that she was already researching my financial background. When I asked about her family, she gave evasive answers, but not before questioning me about my financial situation with a curiosity I found alarming. "And how do you manage on a widow's pension, Margaret? It must be hard to get by on so little money," she had said with false concern. But I was about to show her what real money looked like. What Brittany didn't know was that I had been observing her as much as she had been observing me. Over the next few months, I began to notice patterns that put me on high alert, until I discovered they had been planning to declare me incompetent. Every time they visited my house, she would make comments about how outdated everything was, about how I deserved something better in my golden years. But her eyes always lingered on the details that really mattered: the prime location of the house, the panoramic view from my backyard, the size of the rooms. What she didn't know was that this house was my least valuable property. One day while Michael was in the bathroom, I heard her speaking softly on the phone in my kitchen. "Yes, Mom. His mom's house is in a super expensive area. If I can get her to move to a smaller place, we could stay here until we have our own place." But that wasn't even the worst part of her plan. "She's so naive, she'll probably even thank us for helping her with the transition." Her words cut through me like a knife, but I maintained my composure when she returned to the living room, feigning innocence, until I realized I had been financing their entire conspiracy. From that moment on, every interaction with Brittany became a carefully orchestrated performance on both our parts. She played the concerned daughter-in-law, worried about her mother-in-law's well-being, while I pretended to be the vulnerable widow who needed guidance. But inside, I was gathering evidence that would destroy them. But inside, I was collecting information, observing her moves, understanding her true motivations. It was like a game of chess where we both thought we were winning, until I discovered the full scope of their financial desperation. The following months brought a gradual escalation in her manipulation attempts. First, there were the subtle suggestions. "Margaret, I've seen some lovely apartments for people your age, with full services and no maintenance worries." Then came the more direct pressures. "You can't keep living alone at your age. It's dangerous. What if you fall and no one finds out for days?" What I didn't know was that they were drowning in debt. Each argument was designed to make me feel incompetent and helpless. Michael, my own son, began to echo the same phrases like a trained parrot. "Mom, Brittany is right. Maybe it would be better for you to consider moving to a more manageable place." Seeing him gradually transform into that woman's puppet was more painful than any direct insult, until I discovered they owed over $140,000. The psychological campaign intensified after they announced the pregnancy. Visits became more frequent, but also more tense. Brittany had started bringing real estate magazines and brochures for senior communities. "I'm just exploring options for you, Margaret. I want to make sure you have the best quality of life possible," she would say, spreading the materials on my coffee table, as if it were a business negotiation. But I had been doing my own research. What I discovered would change everything I thought I knew about my son. One afternoon, when they went out to run errands for the baby, I decided to call an old friend who worked in real estate. "Sarah, I need you to investigate something for me," I told her. "There's a couple who are very interested in my house, and I want to know more about their real financial situation." What I discovered chilled me to the bone. Brittany and Michael were neck-deep in debt. The lifestyle they were planning cost more than $80,000 annually, completely financed with credit cards and personal loans. The house they were renting was on the verge of eviction for non-payment, until I discovered I had been their secret financial lifeline. The luxury cars they drove were financed with payments they couldn't afford. Their lifestyle was a facade built on suffocating debt. Everything started to make sense. The rush to have the baby, the insistence that I move, the constant comments about my economic vulnerability. It wasn't love that had united this couple. It was the desperate need to find a solution to their financial problems. And my house, located in one of the most exclusive areas of the city, was their lifeline. The revelation hit me like a slap to the soul. My son, the boy I had raised with values of honesty and hard work, had chosen the easy path of manipulation and deceit. But there was something else that would break my heart completely. He had allowed an ambitious woman to convince him to see his own mother as a resource to be exploited instead of a person to be loved and respected. But what I discovered next was even worse. For the past 6 months, Michael had been regularly calling banks and insurance companies, asking about loans against elderly people's property. He had been asking about legal procedures to obtain financial power of attorney over senior citizens. My own son had been planning my systematic dispossession for months. The most painful information came at the end of the report. According to a private investigator Sarah had hired, Brittany had been telling her friends that she had sacrificed herself by getting engaged to an older, less attractive man because his mother had valuable properties and no competitive heirs. To her, marrying Michael wasn't love. It was a strategic investment in my estate. That revelation had been the final straw. For weeks, I had considered simply revealing my true financial situation to them, thinking that maybe the shock would make them reconsider their behavior. But after reading that report, I understood that it wasn't about money or desperation. It was about pure, calculated greed that had corrupted my son until he was unrecognizable. 20 minutes had passed since my call to Robert, and every second felt like an eternity. From my car, I could see the golden lights of the living room, hear the cheerful music and laughter spilling out of the open windows. But in 10 minutes, that laughter would turn to horror. It was surreal to think that in just a few minutes, that celebration would turn into a nightmare for the main players. I closed my eyes and let the most painful memories of the last few months flood my mind. What I was about to reveal would shock everyone in that room. I needed to remember exactly why I had reached this point of no return. The biggest humiliation had happened just 2 weeks before the gender reveal, during what Brittany had called an important family meeting, until I discovered the full extent of their legal conspiracy. She had arrived at my house, accompanied not only by Michael but also by her parents, a perfectly planned ambush. "Margaret, we want to talk to you about your future," Brittany's mother had begun. But what they didn't know was that I had been documenting everything. "We believe it's time for you to make responsible decisions about your life," continued Brittany's father, a burly man who had surveyed my house with the eyes of an appraiser evaluating a property. What they were really planning was legal theft. Their words were rehearsed, too perfect to be spontaneous. Michael had remained silent throughout the conversation, nodding occasionally like a well-trained puppet, until I realized he had been calling banks about my property. Seeing him there, sitting next to a family that treated me like an obstacle, was like watching the son I had raised die before my eyes. "Mom," he finally said, in a voice I no longer recognized. They're right, but he had no idea what he was about to lose. "And if I refuse?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. "Margaret," Michael said, his voice sounding rehearsed, "we hope it won't be necessary to take more drastic measures, but if your mental health deteriorates to the point that you can't make rational decisions," the implicit threat was crystal clear. If I didn't cooperate voluntarily, they would seek legal ways to declare me incompetent. They had done their research. They had planned. They had prepared the ground to take everything I owned by force if necessary. The son I had raised with so much love was sitting right there, allowing strangers to threaten his own mother. That night, after they left with my firm refusal, I cried for the first time in years. Not out of sadness, but for the definitive death of the illusions I had held about my family. I had called Robert immediately. "I need you to investigate something urgently," I had told him through tears. "I want to know exactly what the real financial situation is for my son and his fiancée. Everything. Debts, income, liabilities, everything." The results of that investigation had been devastating. Michael earned $55,000 annually as Sasol's manager, but had it of more than now 95. $0 on credit cards. Brittany worked part-time as a personal trainer, making maybe $18,000 a year, but spent as if she had an executive salary. Together they owed more than $140,000, not counting the loans they had taken out for the gender reveal. The house they rented for $2,800 a month was 3 months behind on payments. The cars they drove were financed with payments that consumed 65% of their combined income. They were in financial freefall, and my house represented their only hope of salvation. But there was something else in Robert's report that had completely broken my heart. For the past 6 months, Michael had been regularly calling banks and insurance companies asking about loans against elderly people's property. He had been asking about legal procedures to obtain financial power of attorney over senior citizens. My own son had been planning my systematic dispossession for months. But the most painful revelation was yet to come. According to a private investigator Robert had hired, Brittany had been telling her friends that she had sacrificed herself by getting engaged to an older, less attractive man because his mother had valuable properties and no competitive heirs. To her, marrying Michael wasn't love. It was a strategic investment in my estate. Headlights of a car approached the parking lot, illuminating the night with a white light that momentarily blinded me. It was Robert, punctual as always, arriving with the documents that would change everything forever. The moment of truth had finally arrived. I got out of my car and walked toward him, feeling how each step took me further away from the Margaret I had been, and closer to the woman I needed to become. "Mrs. Thompson," Robert said as he got out of his car, a legal briefcase under his arm. "Are you absolutely sure about this? Once we go in there will be no way to undo what is about to happen." But there was no undoing what they had already done to me. I looked towards the living room one last time, where my son and his wife were probably still celebrating their victory over the useless old woman they had just humiliated. I have never been more sure of something in my life, Robert. It's time for them to meet the real Margaret Thompson. And the truth was about to destroy everything they thought they knew. Robert opened his briefcase under the parking lot light and began to show me the documents he had prepared with his characteristic efficiency. "Mrs. Thompson, here is the order for the immediate suspension of all bank transfers you have been making in Michael Thompson's name," he said, pointing to the first paper. What they didn't know was that I had been their financial lifeline for 2.5 years. Also, here is the notice of cancellation of the lease agreement that you had confidentially guaranteed. The landlord will receive this document tomorrow morning. I took the papers with trembling but determined hands. Each document represented a thread I was about to cut forever. Each document represented a thread that I had carefully woven for years to protect my son. And now I was cutting those threads one by one. "And the payment for the house?" I asked, although I already knew the answer. "Cancelled," Robert confirmed. "The deposit you had guaranteed will be withdrawn tonight." And they would discover this in the most humiliating way possible. The magnitude of what I was about to do hit me like a cold wave. For 2.5 years, I had been the invisible safety net that had kept Michael and Brittany's lives afloat. But tonight, that safety net was being permanently removed. The house they lived in, the car he drove, even the gender reveal that was taking place at that very moment had all been made possible by my secret financial support. And now they were about to face the consequences of their greed. We walked together toward the house entrance, and with each step, I could feel my heart beating faster. It wasn't nervousness I felt. It was the anticipation of justice finally being served. It was a strange mix of sadness for what I had lost and anticipation for what I was about to regain. My dignity, my self-respect, my right to be treated as a human being instead of as a resource to be exploited. The music stopped abruptly when we entered the room. The music stopped abruptly when we entered the living room. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward us, and I could see the confusion on the guests' faces. But confusion was about to turn to shock. Some recognized Robert immediately. After all, he had handled the financial affairs of several prominent families in the city for decades. His presence at social events usually meant that something important was about to happen, and tonight would be no exception. Brittany was the first to react. "What are you doing here, Margaret?" she shouted at me from the center of the room, where she had been posing for photos with Michael, but she had no idea what was coming next. "You already left once." Wasn't that enough drama for one night? Her voice carried that arrogance I had come to know so well, but I could detect a note of nervousness that hadn't been there before. Until she discovered who really held the power. "Ladies and gentlemen," Robert said in a clear, professional voice, "I apologize for interrupting this celebration, but I have urgent legal matters to discuss with Mr. Michael Thompson and Mrs. Brittany Dawson." The silence that followed was deafening. The silence that followed was so deep you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Some guests began to pull out their cell phones, sensing they were about to witness something extraordinary. Michael slowly approached, his face pale and his eyes full of confusion. "What's going on here, Mom?" He asked me in a voice that no longer sounded as confident. But his confidence was about to be completely shattered. Who is this man, and why is he talking about legal matters? I could see his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted his tie, a nervous gesture he had had since childhood. "Michael," I said in a voice firmer than it had sounded in months, "this is Robert Jones, my financial and legal advisor. He has come to deliver some documents that I think you will find very enlightening. What they were about to learn would destroy their entire world." Robert opened his briefcase and took out the first document. "Mr. Michael Thompson, you are hereby notified that the financial guarantee your mother had provided for your lease agreement has been immediately cancelled." The color drained from Michael's face instantly. "Your landlord will be notified tomorrow morning, and you will have 30 days to find a new guarantor or vacate the property." All the color drained from Michael's face. "Financial guarantee," he murmured, looking at me with eyes that were beginning to fill with comprehension and horror. But that was just the beginning of his nightmare. "Mom, what is he talking about?" But I could see from his expression that a part of him already knew. For years he had suspected that his financial luck wasn't completely natural. Until tonight, when the truth would finally be revealed. Also, Robert continued relentlessly, "The monthly transfers of $5,200 that your mother had been making to your personal accounts have been permanently suspended." And that's when Brittany's world began to collapse. This includes payments for credit cards, car insurance, and various other expenses that you believed were being covered by other sources. Brittany let out a gasp that echoed throughout the living room. "That's impossible," she exclaimed, running toward us, her maternity dress dragging on the floor. But the impossible was about to become very real. "Michael doesn't have a rich mother. Look how she lives. Look at her clothes, her car. She's an old woman living on a miserable pension." Her hysteria was evident, and several guests began to murmur among themselves with growing fascination, until they learned the truth about my real wealth. "Finally," Robert said, taking the last document from his briefcase, "the guaranteed payment for this celebration has also been cancelled. The house management will have the right to demand full payment before guests can leave tonight." And that's when their perfect world completely crumbled. His words fell on the living room like a bomb, and I could see some guests nervously begin to move toward the exits. The realization hit Michael like a sledgehammer. The realization hit Michael like a hammer. "You," he murmured, looking at me with eyes that couldn't fully process what they were hearing. "You've been all this time. You've been paying for everything." His voice broke on the last word. His voice broke on the last word, and for a moment I saw the little boy he had once been, vulnerable and confused. "For 2.5 years, Michael," I confirmed in a voice that sounded strangely calm after the emotional storm I had been living through. But the storm was far from over. 2.5 years in which I thought I was helping you get through a difficult time. 2.5 years in which I believed you would eventually recover and become the man I raised. Until I realized he had chosen greed over love. Brittany began to pace in circles, clutching her head with increasing desperation. "This can't be happening. This can't be real," she screamed as the guests watched her with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. But it was very real, and it was just beginning. "You're a poor old woman. You work at a library. You drive a 12-year-old car. You can't have money." "Appearances are deceiving, Brittany," I said finally, feeling decades of careful performance come to an end. And now, They were about to learn just how much they had been deceived. For years, I chose to live simply because my husband and I believed that visible wealth attracts problems. It turns out we were right. It's just that the problems came from where we least expected them. The music had stopped completely. And the only sound in the living room was the agitated breathing of the new parents and the growing murmurs of the guests, who were beginning to understand that they were witnessing something completely unexpected. Some were already recording with their phones. Instinctively knowing that this story would become urban legend. "Mom," Michael said, his voice broken. "Please, there has to be some way to fix this. The gender reveal, the guests, everything. You can't destroy all this over a fight. But some bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt." But I could see in his eyes that he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of what he had lost. Not just money or financial support. He had lost his mother, the woman who had loved him unconditionally for 34 years. "The only way to fix this, Michael," I replied, "was not to break it in the first place." And the silence that followed said everything. The silence in the living room became deafening. 40 guests held their breath as they processed what they had just heard. But the revelations weren't over yet. Brittany stood motionless for the first time all night, her eyes darting between Robert, the documents, and my face, as if trying to find a crack in the reality that was collapsing around her. Michael just stared at me with an expression I will never forget. A mixture of shock, belated comprehension, and absolute horror. "Mrs. Thompson," Robert said, in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "would you like me to proceed with reading the full financial details?" And that's when they learned the true scope of my wealth. His question hung in the air like a sword over the newlyweds' heads. I could see several guests moving closer, fascinated by the drama unfolding before their eyes. "Please, Robert," I replied, with a serenity I didn't know I possessed. "I think everyone deserves to know the full truth. What they were about to hear would shock them beyond belief." "Over the last 30 months, Robert began consulting his documents. "Mrs. Margaret Thompson has transferred a total of $156,000 to cover the living expenses of her son, Michael Thompson, and his fiancée." A collective gasp swept through the room. "This includes $54,000 for rent payments, $4,000 for credit card payments, $21,000 for vehicle insurance, and $37,000 for miscellaneous expenses." A collective murmur swept through the living room. Some guests pulled out calculators on their phones. Some guests exchanged glances of astonishment. Others pulled out calculators on their phones to verify the figures. Brittany's mother, who had remained seated at the head table throughout the confrontation, slowly stood up, her face completely pale. Furthermore, Robert continued relentlessly, "Mrs. Thompson personally guaranteed the total cost of this celebration, including the house, food, music, flowers, and photography, for an amount of $38,000. And that money was no longer available. Money which, as I mentioned earlier, is no longer available to cover these expenses." Brittany finally found her voice, but what came out was more of a wail than coherent words. "This is impossible. It's a lie. No one can have so much money and live like a pauper." But she was about to learn just how wrong she was. She turned to the guests as if looking for support, but found only fascinated faces, and some who were clearly amused by her desperation. "My dear Brittany," I said, with a calm that contrasted dramatically with her hysteria, "you have just learned a very valuable lesson about judging people by appearances." And the lesson was far from over. Michael finally reacted, approaching me with hesitant steps. "Mom, please. There has to be an explanation. There has to be a way to resolve this." "But some things cannot be resolved with explanations. You can't destroy my life like this." His voice broke on the last word, and for a moment I felt a pang of maternal pain that almost made me waver. "Destroy your life?" I repeated, feeling the anger begin to boil inside me again, until I remembered everything they had put me through. "I'm destroying your life? Wasn't it your wife who slapped me in front of 40 people?" Wasn't it you who stood by without saying a word while I was being humiliated? The truth of my words resonated like church bells. The truth of my words resonated in the living room like church bells. Several guests nodded, clearly remembering the scene that had started all this drama. Some even had videos on their phones of the slap. Some even had videos on their phones of the slap Brittany had given me, digital evidence of the cruelty that had triggered this revelation. Robert took advantage of the moment to pull another document from his briefcase. "Mr. Thompson, I must also inform you that your mother has decided to amend her will." And that's when their last hope died. "All assets that were previously designated for you to inherit have been redirected to charities dedicated to protecting seniors from family abuse." The impact of this declaration was like a silent explosion. Brittany staggered backward as if physically struck. Brittany staggered backward as if she had been physically hit. "You can't do that," she shrieked, her mask of composure finally falling completely. "We're your family. Michael is your only son. You can't disinherit him over a stupid fight." But this was far more than a stupid fight. "A stupid fight?" I repeated, letting the words hang in the tension-filled air. "Is that how you describe a family conspiracy to strip an elderly woman of her home?" My voice had turned ice cold. My voice had turned icy, and I could see some guests flinch. Brittany's father, who had remained silent throughout the confrontation, finally approached with an expression of poorly disguised panic. "Mrs. Thompson, I think we're all a little upset by the emotions of the day. But emotions had nothing to do with calculated greed. Maybe we could discuss this in private when things have calmed down a bit." His tone was that of a man who had just realized he had bet on the wrong horse. "There's nothing to discuss in private," I replied firmly. "The damage was done, and it was irreversible. Everything I had to say has been said here, in front of the same people who witnessed my humiliation. You chose to make this public, so my response will be public." Robert closed his briefcase with a dry snap that echoed throughout the living room. "Mrs. Thompson, all documents have been delivered and explained. The legal effects will begin immediately." And there was no stopping what had been set in motion. He turned to Michael and Brittany with a professional expression, but not without a certain satisfaction. "I suggest you contact your own legal and financial advisors as soon as possible." Brittany finally collapsed. She literally collapsed into a nearby chair. She literally dropped into a nearby chair and began to cry with uncontrolled sobs that echoed through the living room. "Everything is ruined," she murmured through her tears. "Everything we planned, everything we worked for, it's all destroyed." But what was destroyed were the lies, not the truth. Her maternity dress, once immaculate, was now wrinkled and stained with tears. "No," I said, approaching her for the first time since the slap. "What's destroyed are the lies, the greed, and the lack of respect. And that destruction was long overdue. What's destroyed is the illusion that you can treat people like objects and expect there to be no consequences." I stopped in front of her, forcing her to look up. "This is what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness." Michael went to his wife and placed a trembling hand on her shoulder. But his comfort was hollow now. "Brittany, we have to find a way to fix this. There has to be something we can do." But even as he spoke, I could see in his eyes that he knew it was too late. "Some bridges once burned cannot be rebuilt. There is a way to fix this, Michael," I said, looking him directly in the eyes for the first time in months without feeling pain. "You can learn from this. You can grow from this. But that growth would have to happen without me." My voice softened slightly because despite everything, he was still my son. "But that growth will have to happen without my financial help, without my house, and without my inheritance. You will have to do it the hard way, like everyone else does." And that was exactly what they deserved. The living room remained in absolute silence. Every person present knowing that they were witnessing the definitive end of a family relationship. Robert and I headed toward the exit, leaving behind a living room full of shocked guests and a newlywed couple whose perfect world had collapsed in less than 30 minutes. But my story was far from over. As Robert and I walked toward the exit, the silence behind us was interrupted by a voice I didn't expect to hear. "Wait, Margaret." It was Lucy, Michael's younger sister, who had been sitting at a table in the back throughout the confrontation. She ran toward us with tears in her eyes and an expression of absolute horror on her face. "Aunt Margaret," Lucy said in a trembling voice, "I didn't know anything about this. I swear Michael never told me what they were planning with you." Lucy had always been my favorite niece, a 31-year-old who worked as a teacher and had maintained a close relationship with me even after Michael had distanced himself. If I had known what they were going to do to you, I would have tried to stop them. I stopped and looked at her, seeing in her eyes the same honesty I had known since she was a little girl. "I know, Lucy," I said softly, placing a hand on her cheek. "You have always been different. You've never seen people as opportunities or resources to be exploited." Her tears fell harder as she nodded, clearly devastated by her brother's actions. "But why did you never tell us about the money?" Lucy asked with genuine confusion. "Why did you keep all this secret for so many years?" It was a question that deserved an honest answer, especially coming from someone who had always treated me with respect and genuine love. "Because your Uncle James and I learned a long time ago that money changes people," I explained as some guests discreetly moved closer to listen. "We have seen families destroyed by inheritances, friendships ended by loans, and children who see their parents as walking pensions. We decided to live simply to protect the relationships that really mattered." Lucy nodded slowly, beginning to understand the wisdom behind my decisions. "But Michael, he was different before. When we were kids, he would have defended anyone who hurt you." "What happened to him?" Her question contained all the pain of a sister who had watched her brother transform into someone unrecognizable. "What happened to him was Brittany," I replied with sadness, but without bitterness. "What happened to him was greed disguised as love, ambition without values, and me, in my effort to protect him, depriving him of the chance to learn important lessons about responsibility and consequences." My answer resonated through the living room, where the guests were still engrossed in every word. 3 days after the gender reveal, my house had become a refuge of peace I hadn't experienced in years. Joseph had come over every morning with coffee and pastries from the local bakery, making sure I was okay after what he called the night Margaret reclaimed her dignity. His visits had been a balm for my soul, reminding me that I still had chosen family who valued me for who I truly was. The phone had rung incessantly for those 3 days. Michael had called 42 times, leaving messages that evolved from initial anger to desperate pleading. Brittany had sent 18 text messages, each more hysterical than the last. Her parents had shown up at my door twice, demanding that I fix the mess I had caused. But I had held my ground with a calmness that surprised even myself. Robert arrived that morning with news that, while expected, was devastating in its full scope. "Mrs. Thompson," he had told me as we drank tea on my porch. "I have received reports from all fronts. Michael and Brittany were evicted from their house yesterday morning. The venue has initiated legal proceedings to recover the $38,000 owed. Their credit cards have been cancelled for non-payment." "And where are they living now?" I had asked, although a part of me already knew the answer. "With Brittany's parents," Robert replied. "Apparently it's a 2-bedroom apartment where 3 people already live. The situation is tense, according to my sources." His expression suggested that tense was a very conservative description of reality. That afternoon, while I was watering my plants on the porch, I saw a familiar car park in front of the building. It was Lucy, but this time she wasn't alone. With her was Sarah, my old friend from the real estate sector. And to my surprise, Joseph got out of the back seat. "Margaret!" Lucy yelled from the sidewalk. "We need to talk to you. There are things you need to know." When they arrived at my apartment, their faces wore a mixture of urgency and concern that immediately put me on alert. "Aunt Margaret," Lucy began, "I've been investigating some things since the gender reveal night. Things I think you need to know before it's too late." She sat on my couch with a folder in her hands that looked as official as the one Robert had carried to the living room. "Too late for what?" I asked, pouring tea for her while trying to stay calm. Sarah cleared her throat and spoke for the first time. "Margaret, for the last 3 days, I've been doing some digging into Michael and Brittany's financial situation. What I found goes beyond what any of us imagined. They had been planning this for more than a year," Sarah continued, opening the folder to reveal documents that made me feel sick to my stomach. I found evidence that Brittany had been consulting with lawyers specializing in mental competency cases for seniors. They had a detailed plan to legally declare you incompetent and gain control over all your properties. Joseph, who had remained silent until then, leaned forward with a grave expression. "Margaret, there's more. That night after you left the living room, I overheard Brittany talking on the phone with someone. She was saying that the old woman had ruined everything, but they still had Plan B." His words sent a shiver down my spine. "Plan B?" I repeated, feeling my stomach clench with a mixture of fear and anger. Lucy took my hand and squeezed it gently. "Aunt Margaret, they've been telling everyone you've gone senile, that the scene at the gender reveal was evidence that you've lost touch with reality. They're building a case for a judge to declare that you can't handle your own affairs." The magnitude of their betrayal expanded before me like an infected wound. It wasn't enough to have publicly humiliated me, to have planned to strip me of my home, to have conspired against me for months. Now they were trying to use my justified response to their cruelty as evidence of mental incompetence. It was a wickedness that surpassed anything I had imagined possible. "But that's not all," Sarah added, her voice trembling. "I've discovered that Brittany has been spreading rumors in the neighborhood about your erratic behavior. She has visited several of your neighbors, suggesting that they should report anything concerning they observe about you. The systematic nature of her defamation campaign left me breathless. Robert, who had returned for our scheduled meeting, entered the apartment at that moment and found the atmosphere thick with tension. "Mrs. Thompson, I see you've already found out about some of the recent maneuvers." His expression was more serious than I had ever seen it. "I have some additional news that confirms what your friends have discovered. Michael filed a preliminary petition yesterday," Robert said, pulling documents from his own folder. "He is requesting that a court evaluate your mental competency based on what he calls irrational behavior and erratic financial decisions. He has provided sworn statements from several witnesses who were present at the gender reveal." "Sworn statements?" I asked, feeling the anger begin to replace the shock. "What kind of statements?" Robert consulted his papers before answering. "Statements describing your unjustified emotional outburst against an innocent young couple. Statements characterizing your financial decisions as vengeful and destructive. Statements suggesting that you have lost the ability to make rational decisions." Lucy squeezed my hand tighter. "Aunt Margaret, they've convinced several gender reveal guests to sign declarations. Most of them don't really understand what was going on that night. They just saw an old woman attacking new parents." Her voice contained all the frustration of someone who had seen the truth, but felt powerless to make it prevail. "But we have good news too," Joseph intervened with a smile that contrasted dramatically with the gravity of the situation. "It turns out there are more people on your side than they imagine." He took out his own cell phone and showed me a screen that left me stunned. "Joseph, what is this?" I asked, looking at what appeared to be a social media video with thousands of views. "Margaret, remember that several guests were recording that night? Well, some of those videos have gone viral. People aren't seeing a senile old woman attacking an innocent couple. They're seeing a dignified woman revealing the truth about years of abuse and manipulation." Sarah leaned in to look at the phone, too. "Margaret, the comments on these videos are overwhelmingly in your favor. People are praising your courage, your dignity under pressure, your decision to set boundaries. Some are sharing their own stories of family abuse. You've become a symbol of resistance against the exploitation of seniors." Robert nodded in approval. "This public response will be invaluable if the case goes to court. It's difficult to argue that someone is mentally incompetent when thousands of people are applauding the logic and justice of their actions." His professional smile had returned, suggesting that perhaps the legal battle wouldn't be as one-sided as I had initially feared. But there's something else you need to know, I said, making a decision I had been considering for the last 3 days. If Michael and Brittany want to play this game, if they want to turn this into a public legal battle, then they are going to discover exactly who they're messing with. I stood up and walked to my desk where I had been preparing my own folder of documents. For these 3 days, I have been in contact with several lawyers specializing in elder abuse. I have been documenting everything. The intimidating visits, the implicit threats, the conspiracy to strip me of my property, even the slap Brittany gave me. I took out photographs of my swollen cheek taken immediately after the gender reveal. Medical evidence of the physical assault. If they want war, I continued with a determination I hadn't felt in decades, they will have war. But it will be a war fought on my terms, with my resources and with the truth on my side. Furthermore, I added with a smile that surprised even myself, I have decided to do something I should have done years ago. I'm going to tell my full story publicly. I'm going to show the world exactly what happens when greed is disguised as family love. The room filled with a new energy. The energy of people who knew that justice was on their side and that they had the resources to make it prevail. 6 months after that night that divided my life into a before and an after, I found myself sitting in the most important television studio in the city, waiting for the interview to begin that would tell my full story to the entire country. The program, Stories of a Lifetime, had contacted Robert after the gender reveal videos had accumulated more than 3 million views on social media. My story had become a national symbol of resistance against family abuse of seniors. The journalist, Catherine Diaz, a woman respected for her professional integrity, reviewed her notes while the technicians made the final lighting adjustments. Mrs. Thompson, she said to me with a warm smile, I want you to know that you have inspired thousands of people with your courage. We have received hundreds of letters from viewers who have lived through similar situations. During those 6 months, many things had changed. The legal case Michael and Brittany tried to build against me collapsed spectacularly when Robert presented evidence of their conspiracy to declare me incompetent. Not only did they lose the case, but they were fined for legal frivolity and ordered to pay my attorney fees, which amounted to $52,000. The bankruptcy that followed was swift and devastating. Michael had lost his job when his employer found out about the public scandal. Brittany had tried to start an image consulting business, but the viral videos had ruined her professional reputation. They were now living in a 1-bedroom apartment in the suburbs, working part-time jobs, and struggling to pay their accumulated debts. We are on the air in 5 minutes, the program director announced. I looked at the cameras that would soon broadcast my story to millions of homes, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. At my side was Robert, who had agreed to appear with me to explain the legal aspects of the case. In the audience were Joseph, Lucy, and Sarah, my pillars of support during these difficult months. The most painful thing about these 6 months had been Michael's complete silence. After losing the legal case, he had made no attempt to contact me. There were no calls asking for forgiveness, no letters explaining his behavior, no acknowledgement that his actions had been wrong. It was as if he had decided that it was easier to hate me than to face the reality of what he had done. Brittany, on the other hand, had tried to contact me several times. Her messages had evolved from legal threats to desperate pleas for financial help. The last message, received just 2 weeks earlier, said, Margaret, I know we made mistakes, but we're family. Michael is sick with stress and I'm pregnant again. Please, you can't let your grandchild grow up in poverty. The news of the second pregnancy had been like a dagger to my heart. I was going to be a grandmother again, but my grandchild would grow up in a home filled with resentment toward me. However, I had learned the most difficult lesson of my life. I couldn't save people who didn't want to be saved. Trying to do so only perpetuated their destructive behavior. Mrs. Thompson will start in 30 seconds, Catherine informed me. I took a deep breath and thought of all the people who had written to me after seeing the videos. telling me their own stories of family abuse. Seniors whose children had taken control of their finances. Parents emotionally blackmailed by irresponsible adult children. Grandparents threatened with not seeing their grandchildren if they didn't provide financial support. We are live in 3, 2, 1. The red light on the camera came on, and Catherine began with an introduction she had rehearsed perfectly. Good evening and welcome to Stories of a Lifetime. I am Catherine Diaz, and tonight we have with us Margaret Thompson, a 67-year-old woman whose story has shocked the nation and put the issue of family abuse against seniors at the center of a national debate. Mrs. Thompson, Catherine continued, turning to me, 6 months after the events at your son's gender reveal, how does it feel to know that your story has inspired so many people? Her question was direct but compassionate, allowing me to start on my own terms. I feel grateful, I replied, feeling my voice stabilize as I spoke. Grateful that something as painful as the loss of my relationship with my son has served to help other people in similar situations. For months I felt lonely and confused, wondering if I was the one who was wrong. Now I know that what I went through is more common than any of us would like to admit. Catherine nodded and consulted her notes. Tell us about the years leading up to that night when you started to realize that something wasn't right in your relationship with your son and his fiancée. It was the question I had been waiting for. The opportunity to explain how emotional and financial abuse develops gradually, almost imperceptibly. It started with small things, I explained, remembering those early signs I had ignored out of love. Comments about my age, suggestions that I could no longer take care of myself, subtle pressures for me to make decisions that truly benefited them. Family abuse rarely begins with blows or shouting. It begins with the slow erosion of your self-confidence, with making you question your own reality. Robert leaned forward to add legal context. What Margaret describes is a classic pattern we see in elder abuse cases. The perpetrators, especially when they are family members, use psychological manipulation tactics before proceeding to more direct forms of coercion. It's insidious because it's disguised as loving concern. And the moment of the revelation, Catherine asked, when did you decide to expose the truth about your financial situation? It was the question I knew would come, the one that required me to explain the most difficult decision of my life. The slap, I replied simply. When Brittany slapped me in the middle of the living room in front of 40 people for refusing to hand over the deed to my house, I knew she had crossed a line I couldn't ignore. In that moment, I understood that it was no longer about protecting my family from the consequences of their actions. It was about protecting myself from continuing to be abused. The interview continued for 45 minutes, covering all aspects of my story. I talked about the decision to live simply to protect my privacy, about the years of secret financial support I had provided, about the conspiracy to declare me incompetent, and about the legal battle that followed. Each answer was designed not only to tell my story, but to educate others about the warning signs and available resources. Mrs. Thompson, Catherine said near the end of the program, do you have a message for your son if he is watching this interview tonight? It was the most difficult question, the one I had been both dreading and hoping for. I looked directly into the camera, knowing there was a chance Michael was watching. Michael, if you are listening to this, I want you to know that I still love you. I will always love you because you are my son. But loving someone doesn't mean allowing them to abuse you. Loving someone doesn't mean sacrificing your dignity for their convenience. Loving someone doesn't mean becoming a victim of their greed. The doors to my heart will always be open for you, I continued, feeling tears begin to well up in my eyes. But only if you can walk through them as the honorable man I tried to raise you to be. Only if you can look me in the eye and accept full responsibility for your actions. Only if you can show that you have learned that family is built on love and respect, not on opportunism and manipulation. And for all the people watching this who recognize their own story in mine, I added, addressing the broader audience, I want you to know that you have the right to be treated with dignity, no matter your age. You have the right to make your own decisions about your money, your home, your life. You have the right to set boundaries with family members who treat you badly. And you have the right to seek help when those boundaries are violated. When the cameras turned off, the studio erupted in applause from the production crew. Catherine hugged me with tears in her eyes. Margaret, that was one of the most powerful interviews I have ever done. It's going to change lives. Robert nodded proudly, knowing we had achieved something bigger than winning a legal case. That night, as I drove back home with Joseph, Lucy, and Sarah, I felt more at peace than I had been in years. I had told my story. I had defended my truth, and I had used my pain to help others. No matter what the future held with Michael, I knew I had done the right thing. Margaret, Lucy said from the back seat, I am so proud of you. You have turned the worst experience of your life into something that will protect thousands of people. Her words resonated in my heart as we arrived home. The house that Brittany had once coveted now truly felt like a home again. Not because I had won a legal battle, but because I had finally learned to value myself enough to demand the respect I deserved. I had discovered that sometimes the only way to save a relationship is to be willing to lose it. And as I prepared for bed that night, I knew I had set the most important example of my life, that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, that you are never too old to demand dignity, and that true love sometimes requires the most difficult decisions. My story had ended, but my life was just beginning again. 2 years have passed since that night that divided my life into a before and an after. As I write these lines, I'm sitting on the same porch where I used to water my plants and reflect on the silent humiliations that I thought I had to endure out of maternal love. But I learned that real love sometimes requires the hardest decisions. How different the world looks when you finally find the courage to put a price on your dignity. The morning began, like all of them have for the last 2 years, with a call from Carmen, the coordinator of the Margaret Thompson Foundation for the Protection of Seniors. Yes, I decided to use my name for the charity I founded. Yes, I decided to use my name for the charitable organization I founded with part of my redirected inheritance. Margaret, we have 31 new cases this week, Carmen informed me with that mixture of sadness and determination that characterizes those of us who work in this field. All similar patterns. Adult children pressuring elderly parents for property or money. And each case reminds me why this fight was worth it. Every case that comes across my desk is like looking into a mirror of the past. The foundation has helped more than 500 seniors regain control over their finances, their properties, and most importantly, their self-esteem. Joseph is still my dearest neighbor, although he is now also the foundation's vice president. And at 74, he's found his true calling. His 74 years are filled with renewed energy since he started giving lectures on how to detect family manipulation. Margaret, he told me last week, I never thought my golden years would include becoming a detective for dysfunctional families, but it's the best adventure I've ever had. Lucy moved into the apartment next door a year ago. She chose love over blood relations. Working as the foundation's educational director has given her a purpose she never found in her career as a traditional teacher. Aunt Margaret, she tells me frequently, you taught me that sometimes real family doesn't come from blood, but from those who choose to respect you unconditionally. The success of my public story brought unexpected consequences. But the most unexpected was the healing it brought. The book I wrote became a national bestseller. When Love Hurts, An Elderly Woman Fights Back, sold more than 250,000 copies, and all royalties go directly to the foundation. The question everyone asks me is whether I miss Michael, and the answer is more complex than people expect. The answer is complex and painful. I miss the child he was, the young man who had shown flashes of kindness and honor. But I don't miss the last few years of manipulation, emotional blackmail, and systematic disrespect. Michael tried to contact me exactly 4 times during these 2 years. Each time, it was only about money. Each time he called, it was to ask for financial help never to offer a genuine apology or acknowledge the harm he had caused. The last conversation lasted less than 7 minutes and ended when he said, "Mom, your pride is more important than your grandchildren." I replied with a clarity that surprised me. "Michael, my dignity is exactly as important as my grandchildren, and I hope that one day they learn that lesson better than you did." And for the first time, I hung up on my son. It was the first time I had ever hung up the phone on my son. And it was also strangely liberating. The topic of Oliver and Emma, my grandchildren, is the only one that can still make me cry. But I've prepared for their future in ways their parents never could. They are 3 years old and 16 months old and don't know me. I have created a trust fund for their college education administered by Robert, which will be available when they turn 18, regardless of the relationship we have by then. Maybe, Sarah tells me during our weekly dinners, when Oliver and Emma are older, they will seek their own answers about what happened in their family. And maybe they'll find the courage their father never had. What surprises me most about these 2 years is how much my physical and mental health have improved. During the last few years with Michael and Brittany, I had developed chronic insomnia, constant headaches, and anxiety that kept me in a state of permanent alert. But removing toxic stress changed everything. My doctor says my current tests show the stress levels of a woman 10 years younger. Margaret, Dr. Hernandez told me during my last checkup, it's impressive how the body responds when we eliminate sources of toxic stress. He's right. I walk more upright. My voice sounds firmer and my hands no longer tremble when I make important decisions. And I've found new purpose in unexpected places. The library where I work closed a year ago, but I found a new passion in the community garden I helped establish in the building. I teach other elderly residents about medicinal plants and organic growing techniques. My current routine includes 3 days a week at the foundation offices, 2 days visiting homes of seniors who need emotional support, and weekends dedicated to writing my second book. This one will focus on practical strategies for prevention. This one will focus on practical strategies for detecting and preventing family financial abuse based on the cases we have handled. The house that was once a source of greed is now a space of peace and creativity. I converted Michael's old room into an office where I receive people who need guidance. The walls are filled with thank you letters. The walls are filled with thank you letters, photos of families we have helped reconcile in a healthy way, and diplomas from the universities where I have given lectures. One of the most rewarding experiences of this period has been becoming a mentor to other older women who are facing similar situations. Margaret, 74 years old, came to the foundation 6 months ago after her son sold her car without permission to pay gambling debts. And last week, she sent me a photo of her new car. We worked together for 3 months, and last week she sent me a photo of her smiling in her new car, which she bought with her own savings after legally recovering the money. "Margaret," she wrote to me, "you taught me that setting boundaries is not cruelty, it's survival. You taught me that self-love is not selfishness, it's a necessity. And that's why all this pain was worth it." Her words reminded me why all this pain was worth it. Reflecting on these 2 years, I understand that my story does not have the traditional happy ending where the whole family reconciles. But it has something better. Authenticity. But it has something better. It has authenticity, reclaimed dignity, and a purpose that transcends my personal pain. I have learned that sometimes the greatest demonstration of self-love is to walk away from those who insist on hurting you. If I could send a message to the past, to the Margaret who walked into that living room 2 years ago, I would say, have courage. What is about to happen will be painful. But on the other side awaits a life more authentic than you ever imagined. But on the other side awaits a life more authentic than you ever imagined possible. Peace awaits you. The peace that comes from knowing you will never again allow anyone to treat you as if you were disposable. Tonight, as I finish writing these reflections, I look toward the future with renewed hope. Tomorrow brings new possibilities for justice. Tomorrow I have a meeting with senators to discuss new legislation to better protect seniors from family abuse. Next week, I am inaugurating the Foundation's 3rd regional center. Next month, I will begin a documentary series on this topic that will be broadcast nationally. My life at 69 is richer, more meaningful, and more authentic than it was at 67. And I've learned that endings can be beginnings. I have learned that the end of a toxic relationship is not a loss, it's a liberation. I have discovered that true family is chosen as much as it is inherited. And I have proven that it is never too late to write a new chapter in your own story. When people ask me if I regret what I did that night, my answer is always the same. I regret that it took me so long to find my voice. I regret that it took me so long to find my voice. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I'm looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There's so much more on my channel. Don't forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect.